It was supposed to be a fun road trip and also a chance to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city and explore the countryside. My friends and I piled into the car early one morning, armed with snacks, drinks, and music, ready for a day of adventure. But what started as a thrilling excursion quickly turned into a nightmare, one that I will never forget. We had been driving for hours, taking turns behind the wheel, when we decided to take a detour down a small, deserted road. It was a narrow, winding path, lined with tall trees, and it seemed to lead deep into the forest. At first, we were excited by the sense of mystery and intrigue, but as we drove further in, we began to feel a sense of unease. The road was getting narrower, and the trees seemed to be closing in around us. We could no longer see the sky, and the only light came from the headlights of our car. We started to feel trapped, as if we were being led deeper and deeper into the forest, never to return. That's when we saw the first signs of something wrong. We passed a broken-down car, abandoned by the side of the road. The windows were smashed, and the doors were left open, as if the occupants had fled in a hurry. We didn't stop to investigate, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened there. As we drove further, we started to notice other strange things. We saw a figure standing in the road ahead, but as we got closer, it vanished into the trees. We heard strange noises coming from the bushes, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We were all starting to feel uneasy, and we were discussing about turning back, but we were so deep into the forest that we couldn't find our way back. We decided to keep going, hoping that we would find a way out soon. But as the minutes ticked by, our hope began to fade. It was getting darker, and we could no longer see the road ahead. We were driving slowly, trying to avoid any obstacles, when we saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a long, white dress, and she was staring at us with blank, lifeless eyes. We all screamed and the driver swerved to avoid hitting her, but as we passed, she vanished into thin air. We were terrified and decided to pull over and take a break. We were all in shock, and none of us could stop shaking. We decided to take a short walk to clear our heads, but as soon as we stepped out of the car, we heard a strange noise coming from the woods. It was a low, rumbling growl, like the sound of a large animal. We immediately ran back to the car and locked the doors, but the growling continued, getting louder and more insistent. We could hear something moving in the bushes, and we knew that whatever it was getting closer. We started the car and drove as fast as we could, but the growling followed us, never letting up. We were all sure that we were going to die, that whatever was following us would catch us and kill us. We could see the headlights of our car reflecting off the trees, and we knew that we were getting closer to the end of the road. But just as we were about to break through the trees and into the open, the growling stopped. We were out of the forest, and we could see the lights of a small town in the distance. We pulled over to the side of the road and sat there, staring at each other, speechless. It was an unbelievable encounter, and not all of us could have imagined the same hallucinations. The rest of the trip was fine, but we ensured that we did not use the same route to get back. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. Being a truck driver for almost a decade, I believe I could write a whole 300-page long memoir on the stuff that I have encountered. Among the worst ones which I can recollect from my truck driving stories, it has to be this one. Oh yes, I am sharing my trucking experience without stepping into the realm of the supernatural or extraterrestrial. Because hell yes, I have seen some of that too. I think I could share one of those stories too. But before that, let me tell you about this one incident that had nothing to do with anything paranormal. So now to the story. It happened in my initial years of trucking. It was when I was driving across the Bisty Highway to visit my grandpa who lived in a place called Grants. In case you haven't heard the name before, it is close to Gallup. Now since I was not on duty, I was simply just humdrumming my truck happily down the road. The ride was all good, and I was already anticipating all the fun that I was going to have after meeting my grandpa after a long time. I was around an hour's drive away from my destination when I passed 4 identical solid black Dodge Chargers parked on either side of the road. At first, they looked insanely dope, but when I realized that I was the only driver on the road apart from these four, I felt a little creeped out. What if they were on some top-secret government shadow op, and now they had to assassinate me as I had spotted them? Jokes apart, I thought it was weird to see them there, but I kept driving. I made sure that I don't catch their attention at all. I didn't push the brake at all. Neither did I slow down or anything. In fact, I did not even turn my neck to get a better look. I did ponder upon it for a while, but continued driving no matter what. Now they were parked, so within a minute itself, they were out of my view. They looked pretty dope, and now that I was far from any potential threat, I appreciated the aura they possessed as a crew. Four solid black Dodge Chargers just parked on the side of a highway. I kept driving and looked in my rear view a few miles later, and guess what I saw? The 4 Dodge Chargers. They were trailing me. Again, it was a beautiful sight, but now that they were right behind me, it looked like I was in some sort of trouble. They kept following me and maintained the same distance at all times. If I sped up, they sped up, and when I slowed down so that they could overtake me, they too slowed down. I started getting a bit freaked out after a point, especially when 2 of them broke off and got in front of me, and the third got on my left side and just sat there. It was a very well choreographed movement by them, but it gave me a clear hint that they had done this before. Once that happened, I was preparing myself. I wasn't going to be pulled over and beaten by a bunch of thugs. I pulled the gun out of the center console for my defense. I was ready. I was waiting for one sketchy movement before I would shoot my shots. But they didn't. The ride continued for a couple of miles. In fact, they keep maintaining the same positions up for a good 5 or 6 miles more. Then, they all got in front of me and hauled gas. Gone in a flash. They had no license plates, no temp tags, and nothing on them. It was just a bunch of random drivers who probably pranked me and went off. I don't believe in phantom cars, but that was the closest to what I had seen. I have this another story to share. It was a dark and stormy night when I set out on my long drive home. I had been working till very late and was eager to get home to my family. I had been on the road for about an hour and the rain was coming down in sheets. The windshield wipers were working overtime, but it was still hard to see the road ahead. As I drove, I noticed that the headlights of oncoming cars seemed to be brighter than usual. I brushed it off as just the glare of the rain and continued driving on my way. But as the night wore on, the headlights seemed to be getting closer and closer. I started to feel uneasy, like someone was following me for a long time. I looked in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the closer the headlights seemed to get, the more anxious I became. Suddenly, the car behind me turned on its high beams, blinding me. I couldn't see a thing and had to pull over to the side of the road. As I sat there, catching my breath and waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, I heard a knock at my window. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I rolled down the window to find a man standing there, drenched to the bone. He looked like he had been in a terrible accident. He was covered in cuts and bruises, his clothes were torn, and he had a very weird look in his eyes. He said in a ragged voice,
"Please, help me. My car broke down and I've been wandering for hours. Can you give me a ride to the nearest town?"
I didn't know what to do. The man looked like he needed help, but something about him made me uneasy. But before I could make a decision, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a gun and pointed it towards me. And then he said, waving the gun in my face,
"Just give me a ride."
I was terrified. I had no choice but to do as he said. I got back in my car and he got in the passenger seat. As I pulled back onto the road, he instructed me to drive deeper into the night. As we drove, the man told me his story. He had been in a car accident and had been wandering the roads for days, trying to find help. He was delirious and kept ranting about how he had to get away from something that was chasing him. But the more he talked, the more I realized that he was not making any sense. His story was filled with inconsistencies and contradictions. I assumed that he was a lunatic, maybe a psycho killer. And the further we drove, the more certain I became that this man was not a victim of a car accident, but something far more sinister. I knew that I had to get away from him, but I was too afraid to make a move. The storm outside was getting worse, and the road was becoming increasingly treacherous. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a pair of headlights, but they were unlike any headlights I had ever seen before. They were red, and they seemed to be getting closer and closer. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I knew deep down that we were being followed by something that was not human. The man beside me seemed to sense it as well. He was gripping the gun tightly and mumbling to himself. We drove on, the red headlights getting closer and closer until I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over to the side of the road, got out of the car, and ran into the darkness. I didn't see the lights anymore. They were gone in a flash. I bent to my window to tell him about the sudden disappearing of the light. But to my surprise, he too was gone. I was shell-shocked, and I did not know what to do. Paranoid, I got back in my car and continued to drive on my way back home. Nothing of that sort happened in the remainder of my journey. But I was not high on alcohol or any sort of drugs, or even medications. I wasn't sleep-deprived to see hallucinations of that level. But there were no traces of a man sitting in my car at all. It just gives me chills whenever I think of that night. I remember being told this story by my granddad. Once upon a time, there was a truck driver friend of his, named Daniel. And he had been driving his truck for over 20 years. He had always been a solitary man and enjoyed the long hours on the road, but there was one route that he avoided at all costs. It was a desolate stretch of highway that ran through a remote, wooded area. The locals called it the Devil's Highway and claimed that it was haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. One night, Daniel was forced to take the Devil's Highway due to a detour. As he drove, he began to feel a sense of unease. The trees seemed to close in on him, and he could hear strange noises coming from the woods. He tried to shake off the feeling and focus on the road, but soon he saw something that chilled him to the bone. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, with wild, unkempt hair. She looked as if she had been standing there for a long time, waiting for him. Daniel slammed on the brakes and swerved to avoid hitting her, but she was gone as quickly as she had appeared. Shaken, Daniel pulled over to the side of the road and tried to calm himself. But as he sat there, he heard a knock on the door of his truck. Slowly, he opened the door to find the woman standing there, her face twisted in a grotesque grin. She reached out and touched his face, and he felt a coldness like death. Daniel screamed and tried to push her away, but she was too strong. She climbed into the cab of the truck and sat beside him, whispering in his ear.
"I've been waiting for you, Daniel. I've been waiting for you for so long."
Daniel realized then that this woman was not a woman, but a ghost, one of the many spirits that haunted the Devil's Highway. He was trapped, doomed to drive that road forever, with the ghost of a long-dead woman by his side. From that day on, Daniel's truck was seen driving the Devil's Highway late at night, but no one ever saw Daniel himself behind the wheel. The only thing that could be seen is a figure of a woman sitting in the passenger seat, her ghostly laughter echoing through the trees. The legend of Daniel and the ghost woman still lives on in the small towns along the Devil's Highway, and they say that if you're ever on that road at night, you may be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of the ghost truck, driven by the tormented spirit of Daniel. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The rain was coming down in sheets and the wind was howling, making it almost impossible to see the road. But I was only a few miles from home, and I was determined to make it there safely. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, illuminating the deserted roads. I was the only one out on a night like this, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time a branch scraped against my window or a gust of wind shook my car, I jumped. As I drove, I began to notice something strange. Every time I passed a side road or a driveway, I could see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the eyes kept appearing, closer and closer each time. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. I knew I was getting close to home, but the eyes seemed to be following me, getting closer and closer. I could hear something moving in the bushes alongside the road, and I knew that whatever was following me was getting closer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw my house in the distance. I let out a sigh of relief and pulled into the driveway, but as I got out of my car, I heard a low growl coming from the bushes. I ran inside and locked the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was following me was still out there, waiting for me. I never found out what was following me that night, but I knew that I would never forget the feeling of being watched, hunted, and followed on that dark and stormy night. I've been a trucker for over a decade now, and I've seen my fair share of strange and terrifying things on the road. But nothing compares to the night I drove down that highway. It was a typical long haul, and I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods from the Midwest to the East Coast. I had just passed through a small town and was making my way onto the highway when I first noticed something was off. It was a dark, moonless night, and the only light on the road came from my headlights. But as I drove, I began to notice something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. I quickly swerved to avoid it, but as I passed, I saw that it was a woman. She was dressed in ragged clothes and had long, wild hair. Her eyes were wide and empty, and she was staring straight at me. I quickly pulled over to the side of the road, my heart racing. I got out of my truck and walked back to where I had seen the woman, but she was gone. I thought maybe I had just imagined it and got back on the road. But as I drove, I kept seeing the same woman over and over again, standing in the middle of the road. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger as I drove. I kept seeing the woman and other strange things too. I saw a man standing by the side of the road, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. I saw a group of children playing in a field, but as I drove closer, I saw that they were rotting, their flesh falling off their bones. I knew I had to be hallucinating. I was tired, I hadn't slept in days, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the things I saw, they were too vivid, too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something dark and malevolent. I finally arrived at my destination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had gripped me on that highway. I never spoke of it to anyone, but that night has stayed with me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks on the roads we travel. I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to shake the memory of that night and the things I saw. But I know one thing for certain, I'll never drive down that highway again. I pulled my truck to a stop and checked my map, trying to figure out how I had gotten so turned around. I thought taking a shortcut through this forested area would save me time, but now I was lost on this winding road, surrounded by trees that seemed to tower above me. I looked around for any signs of civilization, but there was nothing but dense forest in every direction. I decided to turn around and retrace my steps back the way I had come, but as I shifted into reverse, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. It was a figure, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, taking a step closer. I froze, my heart racing as I realized that I wasn't alone out here in the woods. I slammed the truck into drive and hit the gas, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever was out there in the darkness. But as I drove, I could feel eyes on me, watching my every move. The road seemed to twist and turn in endless loops, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, like some kind of prey. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but as the night wore on, I began to see movement out of the corner of my eye. It was always just a flicker, a blur of movement in the darkness, but I knew that I was being followed. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped, and the woods around me fell silent. I was about to breathe a sigh of relief when I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing like hot coals in the darkness, just beyond the tree line. They were fixed on me, unblinking, and I knew that whatever was behind them was not of this world. I tried to hit the gas, but the truck wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it in place, rooting me to the spot as the eyes crept closer, step by step. I was paralyzed, unable to move as the creature emerged from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly so, with long limbs that seemed to bend in all the wrong places. Its skin was slick and black, like oil, and its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, and I knew that I was in deep trouble. The creature moved closer, its long fingers reaching out to me as I tried to scramble back. But it was too late. It was like I was caught in a spider's web, its tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me in. I screamed as the creature pulled me towards it, its jaws opening impossibly wide, ready to devour me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving me alone in the darkness, shaken to my core. I kept driving as fast as I could, but the creature was still following me. It was getting closer, and I could feel its hot breath on my neck. Suddenly, I hit a bump in the road and the truck swerved, nearly tipping over. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the creature leap up and over the truck, landing on the other side. I knew then that I had to do something drastic if I wanted to survive. I reached for the shotgun that I kept under my seat and loaded it with a silver bullet. I knew that silver was said to be deadly to werewolves, and I was hoping it would work on this creature too. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded to a stop. The creature was only a few feet away now, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I aimed a shotgun and fired, hitting it square in the chest. The creature let out a blood-curdling howl and fell to the ground. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, the creature began to stir, its body convulsing and twisting. It looked up at me with hatred in its eyes, and I realized that I had only made it angry. The creature leaped to its feet and charged at me. I fired the shotgun again, but this time it didn't even flinch. I knew then that I was in real trouble. I had to get out of the truck and run. I opened the door and jumped out, running as fast as I could into the forest. The creature was hot on my heels, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground behind me. I could hear its ragged breathing and feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running, but I knew I had to keep going. I couldn't let it catch me. Finally, I burst through a thicket of bushes and found myself in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old cabin. Without thinking, I ran towards the cabin and burst through the door. I slammed it shut and locked it behind me, panting and gasping for breath. I was safe for the moment, but I knew that the creature was still out there, waiting for me. As I looked around the cabin, I saw that it was old and abandoned. There was no electricity or phone line, and the windows were boarded up. I was trapped, with no way to call for help. I knew that I had to come up with a plan, and fast. I searched the cabin for any weapons or tools that I could use to defend myself, but there was nothing. The only thing I could find was an old wooden chair. I waited there in the dark, listening to the creature as it circled the cabin. I could hear its claws scraping against the wood, and its breathing was getting louder and more ragged. I knew that it was only a matter of time before it found the way in. Finally, the creature attacked. It smashed through one of the boarded-up windows and leaped into the cabin, its jaws snapping and its claws slashing. I swung the wooden chair, hitting it in the face and knocking it back. But it was only a momentary reprieve. The creature regained its footing and charged at me again. I swung the chair again, but this time it shattered into pieces. I was defenseless. I knew then that I was going to die. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the creature's attack. But it never came. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. I was left alone in the dark, trembling and scared. I didn't know what had happened to the creature or why it had suddenly disappeared, but I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted, the sense of being nothing more than a piece of prey to something far more powerful than myself. Now let's hop onto story number 2. But before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I had been driving my rig for hours, the only sounds around me the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The road stretched out in front of me, long and empty, with nothing but darkness and shadows to keep me company. That's when I saw him, a figure standing on the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. I normally wouldn't stop for anyone, but I felt a strange compulsion to pick him up. As soon as he got in, I knew something was off. He was pale and thin, his eyes sunken and haunted. But before I could ask him any questions, he spoke. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for someone like you." I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine and asked him where he was headed. He told me he was going to a small town just up ahead, and that he needed to get there before midnight. We rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the rustle of the wind outside. But as we got closer to the town, the hitchhiker started to act strange. He muttered to himself and shook uncontrollably, his eyes darting around as if he was seeing things that weren't there. I tried to calm him down, but he just kept getting worse. And then, out of nowhere, he lunged at me, his fingers curling into claws. I swerved off the road and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The truck skidded to a halt, and I watched in horror as the hitchhiker vanished into thin air. For a moment, I sat there, stunned and unsure of what had just happened. And then, I heard it, a low, guttural growling that seemed to be coming from all around me. I looked out the windshield and saw that I was surrounded by figures, ghostly and pale like the hitchhiker. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. And then, they started to come closer, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I knew then that I was in serious trouble. As they closed in on the truck, I saw the hitchhiker among them, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage. He was leading the charge, and I knew then that he was seeking revenge on the living. I prayed for a miracle as the ghosts clawed at the windows and doors, their wails filling the night air. But none came, and I knew that my time was up. The last thing I saw before I closed my eyes was the hitchhiker's face, his eyes filled with a hatred that would never die. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, it was still dark. Everything felt normal, like nothing ever happened. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued driving, but the hitchhiker's words kept ringing in my ears. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze on my neck, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to face the hitchhiker, but he had vanished. My heart pounding, I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck. I searched around, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. I got back in the truck and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering voice coming from outside. It was the hitchhiker, his ghostly figure was walking towards the truck. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. The hitchhiker reached the truck, his face now twisted in a grotesque expression of anger. In a flash, he vanished, and the engine roared back to life. I frantically put the truck in gear and peeled out of there as fast as I could, my heart racing. But as I drove away, I realized that the hitchhiker's ghostly presence was still with me. I could feel his cold breath on the back of my neck and his icy touch on my skin. I knew then that I was not alone, and that I would never be able to escape his wrath. I drove through the night, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, praying that I would make it to my destination. But with every mile that passed, the hitchhiker's ghostly presence grew stronger, and I knew that I was running out of time. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, I saw a glimmer of hope. A small town was just ahead, and I knew that I could find help there. But as I pulled into town, I realized that I was not alone. The hitchhiker's ghostly figure was still with me, and he was now more powerful than ever. I knew then that I was trapped, and that the hitchhiker's revenge would be complete. He had claimed another victim, and I was his torment for eternity. I had driven through many small towns in my career as a truck driver, but this one was different. There was an eerie feeling in the air, a sense that something wasn't quite right. The people in the town all seemed to be staring at me as I drove through the main street, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made my delivery and tried to leave as quickly as possible, but my truck wouldn't start. I got out to check the engine, and that's when I saw them. A group of people, dressed in robes, were gathering around me. They were chanting in a language I didn't understand, and I could feel their eyes on me. I tried to start the truck again, but it wouldn't budge. The cult members began to close in on me, their eyes filled with an otherworldly glow. I knew then that I was in trouble. One of them approached me and whispered something in my ear. It was a language I had never heard before, but I could sense the malice behind the words. I tried to run, but they caught me and brought me to their temple. The temple was a large building at the edge of town, and it was filled with strange symbols and altars. The cult members tied me up and began to perform a ritual, chanting and dancing around me. I could feel the power of their god growing stronger, and I knew that I was in grave danger. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, and the room grew quiet. A figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the god they worshipped, a creature so ancient and terrible that I couldn't even comprehend its form. It reached out to touch me, and I felt a surge of pain shoot through my body. I screamed as the creature began to drain the life from me, sucking out my essence and leaving me a shell of my former self. I somehow managed to break free and hid behind a giant tree. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should run or stay put. My instincts told me to get out of there as fast as I could, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to stay hidden and watch what was going on. The cult members started chanting in an unknown language, their voices rising in intensity with each passing moment. Suddenly, they all fell silent, and I saw the old man I had spoken to earlier walk up to the altar. He lifted a dagger high in the air and brought it down on the sacrificial lamb's neck, spilling its blood onto the altar. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind couldn't comprehend the fact that I had stumbled upon a cult that practiced human sacrifice. I was frozen in place, unable to move or scream. Suddenly, one of the cult members noticed me hiding in the shadows. He pointed in my direction, and the other members turned to look at me. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stumbled and fell as I tried to get away, but one of the cult members caught up to me and grabbed me by the arm. I struggled to break free, but his grip was too strong. He dragged me back to the altar, where the old man was waiting. "You've seen too much," the old man said, his voice cold and menacing. "You must be sacrificed." I screamed and pleaded for my life, but they didn't listen. They tied me to the altar, and I felt the cold blade of the dagger against my neck. As the old man raised the dagger high in the air, I closed my eyes and prayed for a miracle. Suddenly, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The cult members panicked and scattered in all directions, leaving me behind. The police arrived just in time to save my life. I spent the next few days in the hospital recovering from my injuries. I was traumatized by what I had seen and experienced, and I knew that I would never be the same again. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night. The image of the old man holding the dagger and the sound of the cult members chanting haunt me to this day. I learned the hard way that sometimes, curiosity can lead to the darkest of places, and that some secrets are better left undiscovered. I never drove through that town again, and I never forgot the horror that I experienced. The thought that there are other towns like that, filled with dark secrets and hidden rituals, still haunts me to this day. I drove my rig down the unfamiliar road, the tires crunching on the loose gravel. I had taken this shortcut to save time, but I was starting to regret it. The sky was darkening rapidly, and the trees on either side of the road grew taller and thicker, casting an eerie shadow over everything. I glanced at the GPS on my dashboard, but it was no help. The device had lost its signal miles ago, and I was left with nothing but the faint glow of my headlights to guide me. The road seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning without end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going in circles. I had seen no signs of civilization for hours, no cars, no houses, no people. Just the forest, the road, and my truck. Then, something strange happened. The forest around me began to change. The trees twisted and warped, their branches growing into gnarled, claw-like appendages. The leaves turned black, and the air grew thick with a strange, acrid smell. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing in my chest. What was happening? Was I hallucinating? I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, the forest was still twisted and warped. That's when I heard it, a low growling sound, coming from the darkness beyond the trees. It was followed by a howl, high-pitched and mournful. I put the truck in reverse, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the forest had a hold of me, refusing to let me go. The growling grew louder, and I could see a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness. They were red, like embers burning in the night. I could hear something breathing heavily, the sound of hot, fetid air rushing in and out of its nostrils. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The growling grew louder, and I could see the shape of the creature now, its outline illuminated by the headlights. It was massive, with fur as black as the night sky and eyes that burned like fire. I was trapped, with no escape. I could hear the creature getting closer, its breathing growing louder and more frantic. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The creature retreated back into the darkness, leaving me alone in the twisted forest. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I shifted the truck into gear and gunned the engine. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and I shot forward, leaving the forest behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, miles away. I never took that shortcut again, and I never spoke of what I had seen to anyone. But the memory of those glowing red eyes, and the sound of that growling, haunted me for years to come. I had been driving my truck through the barren desert for hours. My only company was the radio and the sound of the wheels on the road. I was getting close to my destination, but suddenly my headlights caught something in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a group of people standing in the middle of the road, blocking my way. I tried to swerve around them, but they were too quick for me. Before I knew it, they had climbed onto the back of my trailer and started cutting through the locks. I knew I was in trouble, so I grabbed my shotgun and prepared to defend myself. As soon as the doors of the trailer opened, I was met with a horrifying sight. The bandits were not human, but rather creatures from a nightmare. Their skin was gray and leathery, and their eyes glowed with an otherworldly energy. They were armed with strange, otherworldly weapons that I had never seen before. I fired my shotgun, but it was useless against them. They simply shrugged off my shots and continued their assault. I tried to fight back with whatever I could find in the truck, but it was no use. They were too strong and too fast for me. Before I knew it, I was surrounded by them, trapped and helpless. They seemed to be enjoying themselves, taunting me with their twisted laughter as they closed in for the kill. I could feel their breath on my skin, their razor-sharp claws digging into my flesh. Just when I thought it was over, a bright light filled the sky. The creatures shrieked and recoiled in fear, their forms dissolving into ash as the light consumed them. I could see a shape moving in the distance, silhouetted against the light. As it got closer, I realized it was a spaceship hovering above me. A beam of light shot down from the ship, enveloping me in a warm glow. I felt a sense of peace and safety wash over me as I was lifted off the ground and into the ship. Inside the ship, I was met by a group of beings who looked human, but I could tell they were not from this world. They explained to me that they had been tracking the bandits for some time, and that they had been responsible for countless attacks on innocent people like myself. They thanked me for my bravery in fighting back, but warned me that the creatures would continue to hunt humans until they were stopped for good. I knew I had been lucky to survive, and I promised to do whatever I could to help. As I was released from the ship and returned to my truck, I knew that my life would never be the same. I had seen things that no human should ever have to see, and I had been a witness to a battle between worlds. But I also knew that I had been given a second chance, and that I would use it to fight against the darkness that had nearly consumed me. I was driving my truck down a desolate road in the middle of the night with my 2 other trucker buddies. We were headed to a warehouse in the middle of nowhere to make a delivery. The only sounds we could hear were the hum of our engines and the occasional crackle from the radio. We had been driving for hours, and it felt like we were in a world of our own. As we neared our destination, we stopped at a gas station to fill up our tanks and grab a bite to eat. The gas station was old and run down, with a flickering sign that read "Open 24 hours." We pulled up to the pumps, and I went inside to pay. The inside of the gas station was dark and dingy, with a flickering fluorescent light that gave everything a sickly green tint. I approached the cashier, an old man with sunken eyes and a weathered face. He looked at me with a blank expression and said, "You boys be careful out there. There's things out in these parts that don't take kindly to strangers." I brushed off his warning and paid for our gas and snacks. As I walked back to the truck, I noticed that the other 2 truckers were acting strangely. They were huddled together, whispering and glancing nervously around the gas station. I asked them what was wrong, but they just shook their heads and told me to hurry up. As we pulled out of the gas station and continued down the road, I could feel a sense of unease settling in my gut. The air around us felt heavy and oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and a distorted voice spoke through the static. "You boys best turn back now. This ain't no place for outsiders." We looked at each other in confusion, wondering where the voice was coming from. It seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the darkness like a ghostly whisper. Just then, a figure appeared in the middle of the road ahead of us. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress and with long, tangled hair that obscured her face. She was standing perfectly still, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As we got closer, the woman began to move. She glided towards us with an unearthly grace, her hair whipping around her face like a storm. And then she vanished, disappearing into thin air right before our eyes. We were all stunned into silence, unsure of what we had just witnessed. And then, as if on cue, we heard the sound of footsteps approaching our truck. They were slow and deliberate, as if belonging to someone or something with a purpose. Without warning, the back of our truck opened, and a chill wind swept through the cab. And then we saw them, the ghosts of all the people who had died on this stretch of road over the years. There were men, women, and children, all staring at us with hollow eyes and expressions of terror frozen on their faces. They reached out to us with spectral hands, trying to pull us out of the truck and into the darkness beyond. We tried to drive away, but our truck wouldn't start. We were trapped, surrounded by the ghosts of the dead. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished into the night, leaving us alone and shaken. As we made our way down the dark, deserted road, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a thick fog descended upon us, engulfing the road and making it nearly impossible to see. I slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop just in time to avoid plowing into an abandoned vehicle on the side of the road. As we got out of our trucks to inspect the car, we heard a faint whispering sound coming from the fog. We couldn't make out what it was saying, but the hairs on the back of our necks stood on end. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, and we saw a figure emerging from the fog. It was a woman, her eyes blank and her skin pale as a ghost. She was dressed in a tattered gown, and her hair was wild and unkempt. She approached us slowly, her arms outstretched, and we couldn't move. She spoke to us in a voice that was both ethereal and terrifying, telling us that we were on sacred ground and that we needed to leave immediately. We tried to ask her what she meant, but she simply vanished into thin air, leaving us standing there, dumbfounded. We got back into our trucks and tried to shake off what we had just seen, but the feeling of unease lingered. As we approached the warehouse, we noticed that the entire area was shrouded in the same thick fog we had encountered on the road. We parked our trucks and approached the warehouse on foot, but as we got closer, we realized that something was horribly wrong. The door was ajar, and there was a sickly sweet smell emanating from inside. As we cautiously entered the warehouse, we saw that it was littered with corpses, all of them mangled and torn apart. We tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind us, and we were trapped. We heard the same whispering sound that we had heard on the road, and we knew that we were not alone. We were being watched, stalked by something that was not of this world. We tried to fight back, but it was no use. We were hopelessly outnumbered, and the creature that had been haunting us was too powerful to defeat. In the end, only one of us made it out alive, and he was never the same again. He spoke of a world beyond ours, a place where the dead walked among the living, and where the only thing that mattered was survival. As for the rest of us, we were lost to the fog, consumed by the darkness that had been haunting us all along. We were just another set of victims in a long line of tragedies, forgotten by time and left to rot in the shadows. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I had been a truck driver for over 10 years and had driven through every kind of weather condition imaginable, but I had never encountered something as frightening as what I experienced that night. I was driving through a rural part of the country, on my way to deliver a shipment of goods to a small town in the middle of nowhere. The sun had long set and I was navigating through the darkness with only the headlights of my truck to guide me. As I approached a particularly dark stretch of road, my headlights suddenly flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, and reached for my flashlight. As I turned it on, I saw a figure standing in front of my truck, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I froze, unable to move or even breathe, as the figure slowly began to move towards me. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress and with long, unkempt hair that obscured her face. Her movements were slow and jerky, as if she were struggling to walk. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong about this woman. As she approached my truck, I could see that her eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion or life. I tried to start my truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of this horrifying apparition. The woman drew closer and closer until she was standing right outside my window. I could see now that her dress was stained with blood, and that her hands were twisted and gnarled, like the branches of a dead tree. Suddenly, she reached through the window and grabbed me by the throat. Her grip was cold as ice and I could feel my windpipe being crushed by her fingers. I struggled to break free, but it was no use. The woman was too strong, too determined to harm me. As I felt myself slipping away, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was the voice of the woman, soft and barely audible, but filled with an otherworldly power. "I've been waiting for you," she said. "You were always meant to be mine." With those final words, I felt my consciousness slipping away, and everything went dark. When I finally awoke, I was alone on the side of the road, with no sign of the woman. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me, but it lingered, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked in the darkness. I was panicking now. The road was empty, and the ghostly figure was nowhere to be seen. I started to calm myself down, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But just then, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and I could feel a chill down my spine. I knew that the ghost was still around. I took a deep breath and decided to move on. I started the truck and tried to drive away as fast as possible. But as soon as I hit the gas, the truck stalled. I tried to start it again, but it just wouldn't budge. I was stuck, and I knew that I had no choice but to face the ghost. I stepped out of the truck and looked around. There was no sign of the ghost, but I could feel its presence all around me. I started to walk towards the back of the truck, and that's when I saw it. The ghost was standing there, right in front of me. It was a young girl, with long, dark hair and pale skin. She was wearing a white dress that was stained with blood. Her eyes were empty, and she was staring straight at me. I froze in fear, not knowing what to do. The girl started to walk towards me, her hands outstretched as if she wanted to touch me. I stepped back, but I couldn't move any further. I was trapped, and the ghost was getting closer. Suddenly, the girl stopped in her tracks and looked up at the sky. I followed her gaze and saw that the moon was shining bright, casting an eerie light over everything. The ghost started to scream, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the night. I knew that I had to do something. I closed my eyes and started to pray. I begged for forgiveness for any wrong I had ever done, and I asked for protection from the ghost. When I opened my eyes again, the ghost was gone. The truck started without any trouble, and I drove away as fast as I could. I never looked back, but I knew that I had experienced something that I would never forget. That night, I learned that ghosts were real and they could be terrifying. I made a promise to myself to never drive that road again, but the memory of that night still haunts me to this day. From that day on, I avoided driving through that part of the country at all costs, afraid that I might encounter that woman again, and that next time, I might not be so lucky. I was driving down the long and lonely highway, making my way back home after a long haul. It was late at night, and I was tired, but I knew I had to keep going. Suddenly, my truck started to sputter and then died completely, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I got out of the truck and looked around. There was nothing but darkness and silence as far as I could see. I tried starting the engine again, but it wouldn't budge. I knew I had to find some help, but I was in the middle of nowhere, and there were no signs of life around me. As I was walking down the road, hoping to find some help, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around and saw a ghostly figure standing behind me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I was frozen in fear as it slowly floated towards me. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The ghost was getting closer and closer, and I could feel its icy breath on my neck. I knew I was done for. Suddenly, I heard a voice calling out my name. It was my friend Jack, who was also a truck driver. He had been driving down the same road and had seen my truck on the side of the road. He had stopped to help me. As soon as Jack appeared, the ghostly figure disappeared into thin air. Jack helped me fix my truck and get it started again. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I knew I had encountered a ghost on that dark and lonely road, and it had almost taken me down. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper behind me. I froze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, as if it was trying to escape. The whisper grew louder and more distinct, until it sounded like a woman's voice. "Please help me," the voice said. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The wind was howling through the trees, and I could feel goosebumps on my arms. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, I heard the voice again. "Please help me," it said. This time, I could tell that it was coming from outside. I hesitated for a moment, but then I opened the door and stepped outside. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. That's when I saw her. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned dress. She was standing in the distance, under the dim light of a street lamp. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was almost translucent. I could feel my body trembling as I stared at her. "Please help me," she said again. I took a step towards her, and then another. As I got closer, I could see that she was floating above the ground. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was as if I had stepped into a nightmare. The woman floated towards me until she was only a few feet away. I could feel a chill in the air, and my breath was visible in front of me. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. The woman didn't reply. Instead, she reached out and touched my forehead with her cold, bony fingers. I felt a surge of energy flow through me, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my truck. The engine was running, and I was driving down the road. At first, I thought it had all been a dream. But then, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the woman sitting in the back seat. I screamed and swerved off the road, crashing into a ditch. I blacked out again. When I woke up, it was morning. My truck was wrecked, and I had a splitting headache. I stumbled out of the truck, and that's when I saw her again. The woman was standing in the distance, watching me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The woman floated towards me, until she was standing right in front of me. "Please help me," she said one last time, before disappearing into thin air. I never drove through that road again. To this day, I can still hear her voice in my nightmares. As we were driving away, I looked back, and the ghost was still standing there, staring at us. I knew that it was going to haunt me forever. From that day on, I made sure to avoid that stretch of road as much as possible. But every time I did have to drive through there, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, wondering if that ghostly figure was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to come after me once again. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. All I wanted was to get home, to my wife and kids, and collapse into my own bed. But fate had other plans for me. As I was driving down a dark, deserted road, I saw something move in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized that it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, not sure what to do. I could see that the figure was wearing a white dress and had long, dark hair. As I got closer, I realized that it was a woman standing with her back to me. She seemed to be crying. I didn't know what to do. Should I stop and offer her a ride? Or should I just drive on by? But before I could make a decision, the woman turned around. Her face was a ghastly white, her eyes black as coal. She looked straight at me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. She had no expression on her face, but I could feel her staring at me, as if she was trying to tell me something. I didn't know what to do. I tried to drive around her, but she stepped in front of my truck, blocking my path. I hit the brakes, but it was too late. The truck skidded to a halt, and I felt a jolt as the woman's body slammed into the windshield. I sat there for a moment, dazed and confused. What had just happened? Had I hit a real person, or was it just my imagination? But as I got out of the truck, I realized that it was real. The woman was lying on the ground, her body twisted and broken. Her eyes were open, staring up at me, and I could see the terror in them. I knew I had to do something. I called 911, and they dispatched an ambulance and the police. But as I waited, I felt a sense of unease. I could feel the woman's presence around me, as if she was still there, watching me. As the ambulance arrived, I could hear the paramedics talking about how there was no pulse, how the woman was already dead when I hit her. But I knew that wasn't true. I had seen her alive, standing in the middle of the road. I drove home in a daze, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. As I pulled into my driveway, I could see the woman's face in my mind, haunting me with her ghostly gaze. I was still shaking with fear, and I knew that I would never forget this experience. When I finally made it home, I tried to convince myself that what had happened was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that it was real. I had encountered a ghost on that dark and lonely road, and it had terrified me to my core. From that day on, I never drove down that road again. But the memory of that night, and the ghostly woman who had haunted me, stayed with me forever. I made sure to avoid that stretch of road as much as possible. But every time I did have to drive through there, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, wondering if that ghostly figure was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to come after me once again.